The Curse of Blackwood Forest. The Forbidden Land. The village of Ashbourne had long warned against venturing into Blackwood Forest. The trees stood unnaturally tall, their twisted branches clawing at the sky, and a thick fog often curled between them like grasping fingers. No animals called it home. No birds. No foxes. Not even insects dared linger there for long. Elias Grayson was not a man to believe in superstition. He had spent his life as a woodcutter, his axe swinging through countless trees, his hands calloused from years of labor. To him, the warnings about Blackwood were nothing more than old wives' tales meant to frighten children. That evening, under a blood-red sunset, Elias entered the Forbidden Forest. The air was heavier here, thick with the scent of damp earth and something else. Something rotten. Yet he pressed on, his axe in hand, determined to claim the wood that others feared to touch. The deeper he went, the quieter the world became. The usual rustling of leaves and distant cries of owls vanished. The silence was unnatural, oppressive, and yet Elias refused to turn back. Then he saw it. In the heart of Blackwood stood an ancient tree, larger than any he had ever seen. Its bark was black as coal. Its roots sprawled across the ground like serpents, and strange symbols were etched into its surface, glowing faintly in the dimming light. Elias smirked. "A tree's a tree," he muttered. He gripped his axe and raised it high. The moment his blade struck the bark, a piercing wail erupted around him. It was not the sound of wood splitting but something alive, something in pain. The ground trembled beneath him, and a sudden wind howled through the forest, though no leaves stirred. Elias stepped back, his heart hammering. His hands trembled, though he told himself it was only the cold. He turned away from the tree and hurried back to the village. But something followed him, an unseen presence pressing against his back, whispering in a language he did not understand. The first signs. That night, Elias awoke to a suffocating weight on his chest. He opened his eyes to find the shadows in his room darker than before, shifting unnaturally. His body felt stiff, his skin tight and itchy. He sat up, gasping, and stumbled toward the small mirror on his wall. His hands were different. His fingers had grown longer, the skin rougher, like bark. His veins darkened, spreading in jagged lines like the roots of a tree. He staggered back, his breath shallow. This was madness. It had to be a trick of the light, his mind playing tricks on him. The next day, he wrapped his hands in cloth, telling himself it was just an allergic reaction, perhaps from something in Blackwood. But the villagers noticed his change. His normally deep voice had become hoarse, as though his throat was filled with dust. His movements were slower, his footsteps heavier, as if the earth pulled at him with unseen hands. He avoided the healer, refused to listen to the whispers of those around him. Yet at night, he heard voices beneath his floorboards, whispers in his ear, rustling in the corners of his room though no wind passed through. And worse, his skin continued to change. The transformation. Days turned to weeks, and Elias could no longer hide the truth. His skin hardened into bark, his fingers curling like twisted roots. His legs grew heavier, his feet sinking into the ground whenever he stood still for too long. He locked himself inside his home, terrified of what was happening. But the village was small, and rumors spread like wildfire. One evening, a group of men, led by the town elder, banged on his door. "Elias, open up," the elder demanded. "We know something is wrong. Let us help you." But there was no help for him. He could no longer speak. The words tangled in his throat like vines, his tongue thick like wood. When he finally opened his mouth, only a hoarse wheeze escaped. The villagers gasped as he stepped into the candlelight. His face was barely human anymore. His eyes sunken into knots of bark. His mouth twisted into an unnatural grimace. His arms had fused with his torso, his fingers merging into gnarled branches. The elder stepped back in horror. "The curse," he whispered. Elias fell to his knees. The floorboards beneath him creaked and splintered, his body growing heavier still. He reached out, but his hands, his branches, could no longer grasp. And then the ground cracked open beneath him. The roots of the damned. The villagers screamed as Elias was pulled downward, his body sinking into the earth as if the forest itself was reclaiming him. He did not fight it. He could not. He was no longer Elias Grayson. He was something else now. As the darkness swallowed him, he heard voices. Dozens. Hundreds. Whispering. Crying. Screaming. And then he saw them. Beneath the forest, beneath the roots of the ancient trees, were others like him. Twisted figures, their faces frozen in agony, their bodies half merged with the earth. Some had been there for centuries, their voices now mere echoes. "You disturbed the sacred land," they whispered. "Now you belong to it." Elias tried to scream, but no sound came. His mind remained, his thoughts still human, but his body was not his own. His limbs stretched, his roots dug deeper, and his face became just another part of the endless, cursed forest. The warning. The village of Ashbourne still stands, but no one dares enter Blackwood Forest. The trees whisper at night, their branches swaying though no wind moves them. Some say if you listen closely, you can hear the sorrowful wails of those who were claimed by the land. And in the heart of the forest, there stands a tree unlike the others. Its bark bears the anguished face of a man, his mouth open in a silent scream. A warning to all who dare to disturb the cursed woods.